This is London, the capital of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. At one time, much of the world was ruled from here. The British Empire stretched from colonies in America, sultanates in India, isles in the Caribbean, and desert kingdoms in Africa. For such a small place, it's only a bit larger than Greece, and even today has less than 65 million people. Its influence on the world has been extraordinary. Shakespeare, the Industrial Revolution, the English language, even the Beatles, all hail from the United Kingdom. The UK has also had, and still has, a remarkable impact on the democratic world. We see the origins of human rights law in the Magna Carta, signed in the year 1215. And the UK's legislature is called the mother of all parliaments because of its role as a model for new democracies over the past 200 years. In world politics, the UK is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a leading member of the European Union, and the United States' closest ally. There's no question that knowing this England, as Shakespeare called it, is to go a long way towards understanding democracy itself. I'm Bob Beatty, and in this program we will explore the British political system to better know and understand the keys and nuances of a parliament that in some form or other has influenced every single democracy in the world. Next hour, we'll focus on the British parliamentary system. What is the British Parliament? What does an individual member of the House of Commons, or MP, do? And what is up with the House of Lords? We hope to answer those questions and more as we cross the Thames River to the Palace of Westminster for this program, The British Parliament.
The British parliamentary system is essentially a parliamentary rather than presidential system. We have 659 MPs. Each one of them has their own constituency, and the aim of Parliament is essentially, of course, to run the country. However, what really matters in Parliament is that members of the government, Tony Blair, for example, is also an MP, so are most of the major ministers. They're all MPs, and therefore, of course, we don't have separation of powers in the sense that you would have in the United States. Control of the parliamentary timetable is very much the responsibility of government. And in fact, most of the work of Parliament, although sometimes it seems very exciting when we have things like Prime Minister's Question Time, when the parties appear to be fighting it out across the floor of the House of Commons, most of what goes on in Parliament is relatively routine.
So, well, first of all, actually, incidentally, sorry. First of all, I should welcome the Right Honourable Gentleman to his new position. And to say how delighted I am that someone written off under the last Conservative government is now given the chance to rehabilitate himself under Labour.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for his warm words of welcome, but I'm afraid he really didn't answer the question. Let me give him the answer. Let me give him the answer.
I love the job I'm doing. I mean, it's a wonderful place to be here. I mean, I got here in my mid-50s, rather later in life than most MPs, and it's a great liberating position to be here, to know that instead of shouting at the television, you can face with the Prime Minister and tell him where he's gone wrong, and you can have a little bit of influence on how the world is run, and particularly how Britain is run. So it is, I mean, it's a wonderful job for anyone to be in. I mean, I do it for nothing. I mean, if I need money, I'd pay to do it, but they actually pay you as well, which is extraordinary. But I believe it's probably the most satisfying job that I could do, and unless you can be a great surgeon or someone else where you can save life or make a great difference and make some major scientific discoveries. If you're a person of average ability, I believe you can have a very satisfying life in the world of politics, as long as you set out what your horizons and your aims are.
You divide your role up really, I think, into three areas. The first is representing your constituency, and that's a very intimate relationship here. I represent 60,000 adults, 60,000 voters. Most of them feel they have a claim on my time. They can come and see me if they want to book in and see me at a surgery with a personal problem. Then they can usually do that within a week or two. And I'm in the district, the constituency, every weekend, and I'm expected to be there and be involved in their events. So it's a very intimate relationship. And so I have a sort of primary duty to take up their personal problems. If they can't, you know, they've got a problem with their welfare benefits, or they've got a problem with anything that's going through Parliament at the moment, they bring it to me. The second role is your role in Parliament, where as an opposition member, what you're seeking to do is to be a good legislator. It's a kind of slightly more confused role here because we've got the executive in Parliament, so you're both trying to be a legislator and hold the executive to account at the same time, and we've got ministers coming before us that we can actually question, so a lot of your time is about grilling the executive. There's that parliamentary role, and then the third role is your party role, and the party role will vary from individual to individual. I've taken on a substantial responsibility as a spokesperson on information technology, so a lot of my time is taken up creating policy for my party on information technology, meeting people in the industry, and really sort of pushing the cause to show that my party is doing well in information technology.
Primarily, it is to represent the views of the constituents of Beckenham in the House of Commons and to take an active part in the legislative process. There is, however, a lot of pressure, and this is actually a fundamental constitutional change, where an MP is seen to be doing an awful lot of social work. And the social work aspect is sorting out constituents' problems that frankly should have been sorted out by the organisations involved long before they get to the level of a Member of Parliament.
I mean, my main job as MP is to represent this area and the people who live in the area. So first and foremost, I take the constituency casework and the dealings that I have with individual constituents as my top priority. Sometimes that means acting almost as a social worker. Sometimes it involves acting as an advocate, often with bureaucracies or agencies that don't give unless they're pushed hard enough. But, and this is the special role an MP can play, often it involves picking up an individual local problem and pursuing it nationally, either with ministers, civil servants or national agencies. And sometimes using public exposure in Parliament as a way of reinforcing pressure. So it's picking up casework, number one. And last year I dealt with just over 1,500 individual cases. And that's out of a total population in the constituency of about 60,000.
There are a number. I've done 10 commandments on the party, which I can't remember them all. But I think the most important one is, as an MP, I mean, certainly to support my party is there, but to enlarge its horizons, to convey messages in a way that's coloured with humour and with a lightness of touch, we hope, so it becomes palatable, so to communicate effectively. But I think the most important of my 10 commandments is that we should neglect the rich, the obsessed, and the tabloid press and seek out the silent voices. The people that we should be serving are those who don't beat a path to our doors. They're the ones who are not articulate and not well-heeled and not advantaged. And if we do that successfully, we serve our people well as their representatives.
Is that all right?
Every MP, or Member of Parliament, takes on a number of roles as a member of the House of Commons. The first is the legislative and scrutiny role, in which MPs shape, debate, and scrutinize legislation. MPs also have to represent their constituency, a role which is taking more and more of their time and has made some, such as Jackie Late, say that she sometimes feels like more of a social worker than an MP. Part of this role is scheduling what are called advice surgeries. These are appointments MPs have with constituents to hear their problems and concerns. Problems and concerns that constituents often expect MPs to take back to London and do something about.
And do you get out when there's not an election and still meet people? Or,
I do. I do my fixed advice surgeries in the office and at the town hall, but I also do street surgeries. So I'll leaflet 200 houses, for instance, and if they want to see me, they'll put it up in the window and I'll call and see them. So what I find is that if you go to people like that, then you come across problems and they contact you in a way that makes it better. They'll come to me if I go to them.
My godmother was an MP, coincidentally, in a neighbouring constituency, and she used to be able in the 60s to reply to all of her constituents' letters by hand. I now have 2 staff, and it's been an exponential increase, and in fact it has worsened since 1997 because an awful lot of the Labour members who came from a social work public sector background, felt that their job as an MP was much more to be a social worker. And so a lot of the changes that have taken place in the House of Commons has been to facilitate the social work role rather than the legislative and scrutiny role.
We're going to do a shopping.
So you're doing something wrong somewhere?
Well, we used to sell Margaret Thatcher, this bandit, South Yorkshire with 10p.
Are you waiting for him?
Yeah.
To be 10p.
Wait,
I'm just having a look.
It'll come back again. Let's go to shopping.
Another role for many MPs is the party role. Along with his other duties, John Healey served as the personal private secretary, or PPS, for Gordon Brown, Secretary of the Exchequer in the Blair government.
Well, the first characteristic of the week when Westminster's sitting is that it's divided between home here in the constituency and normally about 4 days away down in London at Westminster. So what I make a point of doing is dropping our 6-year-old son off at school first thing on a Monday morning, and I stick to that come what may, and then normally I go to the train station straight down to London. What I like to try and do is clear as much as I can when I'm down there. So I have a ridiculously long working day down there. I take the view that if I'm in London, I'm in the Commons, I may as well be working. So Monday to Thursday, I'm in London. I do whatever I can to get home again on Thursday night. I don't care if it's 2 in the morning. If I can do that, I'm there when he wakes up in the morning on Friday, and again I take him to school on a Friday. So Monday to Thursday in the Commons, I would try and do a couple of hours casework and correspondence before about 9 o'clock in the morning. Most of my morning would be tied up with meetings at the Treasury, sometimes without Gordon Brown. That's part of my job as PPS. The afternoon, there may be duties in the Commons, committees or in the Chamber. Part of my job as parliamentary aide to Gordon Brown is to be his eyes and ears in Westminster, so I have to be around and I have to be available for MPs that can't get to Gordon but get to Gordon through me. And so I normally will get back to my desk again at about 10 p.m. and then often 3 or 4 hours clearing what I haven't been able to do during the day, mixture of casework, bit of research, work on the different issues I'm following, and then back again in the morning. So that's Monday to Thursday. And then Friday's a day devoted to the constituency, work in the office here, picking up casework, sometimes surgeries, advice surgeries, often visits, local groups, employers, things like that. Saturdays would tend to be advice surgery in the morning, and then I normally try and stop at that point, so that Saturday afternoon and Sunday is there for the family.
Because I don't want to interrupt Nigel's dealing with a gentleman who's got some interesting views. I'll just give you background. Quite often people have difficulty with the health service because of waiting times and waiting lists. And his particular case, he'd been waiting for quite a long time for this operation, a very serious operation too. And it had not come through, so I worked with his doctor, his normal doctor, to see if we could get it brought forward. And eventually we did. Now, it shouldn't work like that. I mean, it shouldn't be a letter from an MP that says, come on, you know, this ought to happen. Yeah. But in that particular case, we were able to just make sure that all the medical evidence was put forward, and eventually they did bring it forward, and it was...
And you supply a letter and a phone call and just sort of...
And chase. And Nikki and my colleagues in the office also then do an automatic follow-up. If we haven't had a response after a certain period, automatically follow up and see what's going on.
Wow.
All right?
Unlike in the United States House and Senate, members of the British House of Commons are not given a large office staff and have to do much of their casework, speechwriting, and research on their own.
I've got 3 staff. We have a sum of £70,000 for staff now, which is very generous compared to what we had in the past. So we can employ 2.5, 3 people at good salaries, at adequate salaries to survive in London. And I depend on them greatly. They're 3 talented, resourceful people who are good researchers, who can write reports and give me a hard time, and will all tell me when I'm wrong, and which is the best thing to look for in staff. Staff who will tell you off and tell you when you're being lazy or foolish or underachieving.
I get an allowance each year. It's a set pot of money. It is about £50,000. From that I have to employ staff, I have to rent my office, I have to buy stationery, I have to cover the cost of my mobile phone or pager, so it has to cover the whole lot. That allows me to employ 1 full-time member of staff here in the constituency and 1 part-time member of staff to support me down in Westminster, and that's my total staffing. That probably means I do a lot more hands-on individual casework than your average US politician. It also means I'd probably do a lot more of my own research, speech writing, writing of articles for the media, all that sort of additional stuff. I tend to do a lot of. I like doing it, but I don't have the staff to support me.
I mean, we have a lot smaller constituency than American politicians. Of course, there are about 70,000 people on my patch, which is enough to look after. But I think we also have the support of a library staff. It's very good, and other staff here. If we're going to do a bill, we rely on those to take us through the system and to actually draft the bill. So we're okay, and things are so much better than they were. When I came here 20 years ago, we are much better off. But the work increases to fill the available time. And you can you can go off and live in America if you wanted to as an MP. They still pay your wages. It doesn't make any difference. Or you can work around the clock and still go around with your head in a cloud of guilt because you feel you've neglected this or you haven't done as much for that constituent as possible. But I believe it's reasonable at the moment compared to most parliaments and most regional parliaments. We're better paid and we have better allowances than ever before, and they've increased by a great amount in the last 10 years.
There's a great deal of party discipline in the House of Commons. Each of the political parties expects its members to follow the party line, and most of them do. They follow the party line not necessarily because they're bullied or cajoled into taking decisions which they fundamentally disagree with. There's what one writer has called a culture of obedience, whereby MPs who've always supported a particular party, once obviously they're in Parliament, will continue to do so. And certainly, okay, there are mechanisms whereby party discipline is ensured, and sometimes threats or even bribes are offered in the form of jobs and whatever to individual members. They just generally do follow the party line. Also, it's sometimes very difficult to hide because the voting system in the House of Commons is in no way electronic. Each member of Parliament it is clear who he or she what he or she is voting for, simply because they pass through a particular lobby, and by passing through the lobby they're then counted and their votes are registered. So it does make life difficult for those who, shall we say, wish to express opinions that are in opposition to the party line.
Yes, I think it's compared to most legislatures throughout the world that MPs vote for their own parties, taken as a matter of loyalty. There's some justification for it because we were elected as representatives of what Labour stands for, or what Conservatives stand for, or what Plaid Cymru stands for, rather than for our own personalities, because we're wonderful human beings. I think we accept that. People don't vote for persons, they vote for parties. So there is a general understanding that the right thing is to support what the Labour Party supports. Well, I think I've voted against my party in this Parliament about 20 or 30 times, and there are issues in which the party has been, I believe, profoundly wrong. And I'd have the support of my local party, my constituency, would be backing me on that. The principal one has been on the Iraq War, where I believe we were deeply and seriously wrong. And we took a decision on an entirely false basis, on the belief that there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which clearly there weren't. And we sent British soldiers in to kill and be killed on documents that were forgeries and falsehoods.
So are there some votes in which the party says we really need everybody to vote for this one? Are there other votes where they say do whatever you want?
Yes, they are. There are votes where we have a system of whipping one line and three line whips. One line whip, you can virtually not be here, and you really don't have to vote for the party, don't be worried about it. But when they impose a three line whip, it means that they want to know if you're opposing it. They will try to persuade you otherwise if you state what your views are. And on the Iraq War, there was a huge amount of pressure put on all MPs in the group and individually in order to persuade people to support the government line. But 140 MPs didn't support the government, which is the biggest revolt there's ever been, I think, in history, certainly for a very long time. Such a large number of MPs, in spite of the pressure put on, which included saying, well, we're going to have a new government, we're going to resign, we're going to, they went nuclear on it with the threats to people. But in spite of that, people felt so strongly that a large number voted against. And of those who voted for the government, many of those are unhappy now because they felt they were deceived by the government whips by presenting a case that's now collapsed.
You're expected to vote for the party on any issue that is regarded as an issue of party policy. And the theory and the philosophy behind that is that you are elected as a Conservative Member of Parliament, you therefore subscribe to the party policy, therefore unquestioningly you should be supportive of the policy. Now, there are times when we have what's called private members' issues, which tend to be matters of conscience, and then the party will decide that there will not be a three or a two-line whip, but there will be what's called a free vote, and you can vote according to your conscience.
Whatever I do as an individual MP, I'm under no real illusions that people in this area voted for me because I was the Labour candidate. Now, I like to think that some of them will vote for me in this election because of what I've also been doing as John Healey, the Labour MP. But essentially, they voted for a Labour MP to be part of a Labour government to produce a Labour programme. Now, I think, therefore, that it's quite a serious step actively to oppose the sort of legislative programme that the government wants to bring in. My job, I think, is to steer and influence it where I can at an early stage, rather than outright vote against the Labour government. I wouldn't rule it out, and there have been a couple of issues where I've been faced with a really pretty difficult decision, unhappy with what we've been planning to do. and having to take a judgment at that point. But the play of the parties, and if you like, the role that the party plays within Parliament is strong.
A key aspect in Parliament is getting your party to vote together, which is the job of the party whips. James Arbuthnot served as the opposition whip for the Conservative Party.
There is more party discipline in Great Britain. There is much less. I don't know whether pork barreling is the proper expression, but there is less of that. Although most things that come to the United States come to the United Kingdom 10 years later. So maybe we'll find the whipping system breaks down in the United Kingdom. The opposition chief whip has a different job in opposition. The government chief whip has a job which is essentially to get the government business through. And that involves using the right arguments, the right persuasive methods on government MPs in order to achieve the business. The opposition chief whip has a much more subtle job, in a sense, which is to keep the morale of the opposition party reasonably good, and to keep them together, to keep them working together for a common goal, so that they, having been, by definition, defeated at the previous election, they've got to improve their showing and their performance for the next election. So keep everyone as properly occupied as possible, giving them proper jobs, making sure that the work is handed to the people with the ability to do it, making sure the allocation therefore of responsibilities are done. So it's a morale job rather than a defeat the government job. At least in the present climate it is. If the government's majority were smaller, it would change, and it might be that then we would have a real opportunity to take the government by surprise and defeat them in a vote. We very nearly did, actually, even with a majority of 170 against us. We did get within 24 votes of beating this Labour Party during the last Parliament. But sadly, the Liberal Democrats were not with us, and so we didn't quite make it.
Well, originally, of course, the chief whip literally had the job of getting everybody into the same lobby to vote in Parliament. And you've, I think, adopted in the States the same name, though people probably wouldn't any longer recognise its origin. It goes back to hunting, in fact, fox hunting, where you have a whipper in who makes sure that the hounds go in the right direction. These days, in my party in particular, it's much more of a liaison and communication role. I have to try and make sure that my colleagues know what business is coming through in the House of Commons, know who's going to speak in a debate, take part in a discussion, going on to committee, and that the team works. If you like, I'm the team manager. I think it's much more comparable these days to the team manager in the sporting field than it is to anybody in the hunting field.
Probably there's less offer to keep you in line by way of enticements or incentives, and more emphasis on an attempt to, I wouldn't say sanction you, but I mean, it doesn't interest me and I don't go on them, but you know, some MPs, you know, enjoy and get a lot out of foreign visits. Now, you know, for any MP that voted against the government, they'd suddenly find that those trips on parliamentary delegations to the Caribbean dried up, for instance. Now, that's not a terribly serious point, but that's an indication of the way it operates. Yeah.
Can a MP be told that he or she won't be the candidate in the next election? Does the party have that kind of power?
Yeah, ultimately, what we would describe as the party whip. That's, if you like, the party sort of stamp of approval and identification of you as in my case, a Labour Party politician could be withdrawn. In rare instances it is. And come the point where selection goes on for candidates at a future election, then that person would find that they could not be a Labour Party candidate.
There can be, in theory, repercussions. In practice, punishment doesn't work nearly as effectively as rewarding people and making them want to vote in the same way. So the job of the Chief Whip is not to punish people. It is to give severe, sometimes, tellings off to people who fail to follow the party line, and that's from time to time what I would do. But once I had reached that stage, I would have failed in that particular aspect. So what I would be trying to do would be to forestall any voting against the party line by knowing everybody in the party very well indeed, knowing what they would be likely to do, making sure that if it was against our interests, they didn't want to do it, by motivating them in the right way. So it's an all-time, constant job of work of assessing people's character and working out how best to get them all to pull together.
Well, there's a tradition that the Conservatives have always been able to ensure on loyalty to their leadership by sidling up to the Member of Parliament that looked as if he might be going the wrong way and saying, George, I know you're not really interested in becoming a Lord, but don't you think Cynthia would like to be a lady? And that's dropping the heavy hint on the Conservative side, which is very effective because they all want to go to the House of Lords. On the Labour side, it's been a different tradition. It's been, if you don't toe the line, my boy, we will tell your folk back home, and they might very well decide they don't want you to be candidate for your safe seat next time. Now, neither of those would work with the Liberal Democrats. We're far too democratic. So I'm afraid in our case, we simply have to persuade people that this is the way to go. And since we are not, any of us, really career politicians, you wouldn't be a career politician if you came to the Liberal Democrats. It's far too difficult to get elected. People on the whole tend to be of the same persuasion, same frame of mind, and fortunately I don't have many problems of party discipline.
One of the more contentious issues regarding constitutional reform in the United Kingdom concerns what to do with the House of Lords. Keep them as they are, scrap them altogether, or somehow reform them. The Labour Party in 1997 campaigned on the idea of somehow reforming the House of Lords. And to be sure, they have been reformed since 1997. But where to go from here? To turn it into some sort of United States-style Senate, or to keep that elite element to it? We did hear from a number of members of Parliament about where to go with the House of Lords.
The House of Lords is quite a unique institution in many respects, because unlike most legislative assemblies around the world, Congress, French National Assembly, whatever, it is not elected. There have been very significant changes in recent years because up until 1999, in theory, the House of Lords had a potential membership of something like 1,100 members, because anyone who had a peerage, which is obviously, you know, being a Viscount or a Lord, you have to, I believe, be at least a Knight of the Realm, was entitled to sit in the House of Lords, as were the senior bishops of the Church of England. Now, in 1999, in response to New Labour's election promises, they did end the hereditary principle, whereby simply the only people who can now sit in the House of Lords are life peers. However, what life peers are simply those who have been given public recognition of their public service, and often are former members of the House of Commons, senior government ministers, but also included are people like former trade union leaders, captains of industry, etc. But they, although have the right to sit in the House of Lords, their peerage does not pass on to their son. So, end of the hereditary principle. The government, however, did do a deal with the House of Lords in that they agreed to allow 92 hereditary peers to remain for a transitional period. And those 92 hereditary peers were chosen by the existing members of the House of Lords. So in reality, although it's not a directly elected body, it no longer is, as I've said, dominated by those who just inherited their titles.
It's very different from Congress. The House of Lords cannot be involved in tax-raising matters, but they look at any legislation that is going through and will often amend it. And at the present moment, the House of Lords is the only legislative forum we've got to really challenge and take on some of the wilder ideas that this government has.
The role of the House of Lords is and always has been to act as a revising chamber and as a bit of a brake on the over-enthusiasm sometimes of elected politicians. So when the House of Commons sends new legislation up to the House of Lords, the House of Lords are able to spend a good deal more time with actually a very deep amount of expertise on that legislation. During the last two parliaments, though, when in the House of Commons there has been such a huge government majority, a majority significantly larger than the main opposition party itself, it has been the House of Lords that has been more effective in holding the government to account, because the government does not have a majority in the House of Lords. The House of Lords feels constrained about using the fact that the government doesn't have a majority, and so from time to time they back away from outright confrontation. But it has been the government's main check and balance apart from the media, because the House of Commons, frankly, at the moment, is not working well.
And the House of Lords is a revising chamber. They do a useful job in that, and having a closer look at legislation than the Commons often does, and they have people of some authority and standing and expertise who can improve legislation. But they're entirely unelected, and they're a mixture of inherited lords who are still there, and they're there mainly because their families had a history in which their great-great-great-great-grandmother was the mistress of a king, or their great-great-great-great-grandfather was a crook, robber baron, wherever it might have been. But they are, it's an extraordinary anachronism, a hangover from the past, that people are not there by the first past the post system, but a system as described by Tony Benn, as the first past the bedpost system. The firstborn would go there. And it's indefensible that people should be chosen on that basis. It was a disastrous experiment to have the people's peers, to have people in who were chosen as representatives of ordinary people. And it was an almighty disaster, because the people who were appointed were very much the same people who were going in there either by birth or because of privilege in life. And I remember hearing the chairman of the committee who appointed the so-called people's peers saying they couldn't have anyone who was a waitress or a bus driver in the House of Lords because they wouldn't be articulate to make their point. But as someone who was a bus driver for 3 years and who married a woman who was a waitress for the same period, I was very offended by that, and both of us can string a few words together and could make a case. But the same kind of snobbery privilege that's been part of the House of Lords for centuries is still there, but there's been a reluctance to change it. A reluctance not only from the Lords itself, who fight tooth and nail to remain there, but also from Tony Blair, who said he's in favour of an wholly appointed chamber.
The United Kingdom's third party, the Liberal Democrats, want to see the House of Lords turn into a wholly elected chamber, as Richard Allen explained.
This is one of the areas where we do have a strong difference with the Labour government. Certainly not everyone in the Labour Party, but with the Labour government, because we firmly believe in a democratic House of Lords the whole approach of the Liberal Democrats has been to be constitutionalists. We actually are quite in favour of a written constitution, a written Bill of Rights, and a defined constitution within which all the various bodies who influence our lives are democratic. And the fact that the House of Lords remains undemocratic is a major problem for us in an area where we have attacked the government very robustly. The Labour Party is split. A lot of members of the Labour Party agree with us. They'd like to see a democratic House of Lords, but the Labour government doesn't want to change things because it's too convenient for them at the moment. Our proposal for the House of Lords would be to replace it with an elected Senate. And we see the elected Senate as being elected in thirds. So senators would serve for 6 years, a third elected every 2 years, which may sound familiar, and that those senators would represent regions of the United Kingdom. So we've looked at what people have for their second chamber in their legislature across the world, and that's quite a common system, that kind of elected Senate, where you're electing people on a different cycle from the first chamber, because the first chamber in the British system has to remain supreme, the House of Commons. The House of Lords is on a different cycle with different powers and people elected for a little longer. But the important thing is that they're elected. At the moment, nobody elects them, they're appointed in there, and if we saw, I don't know, a developing country do that, where the president of Zimbabwe appointed everybody to the second chamber in the Zimbabwean parliament, we'd cry outrage, this is an affront to democracy, and yet we do it here in the UK. So I mean, we feel that way, it's an affront to democracy and needs sorting out. But as I say, there seems to be a real reluctance on the part of the government to tackle this. They seem happy to sort of let it ride as it is now.
We want the second chamber to be elected, and we look with envy at your Senate. We would be quite happy to have a Senate.
Directly elected?
Yes. And we might very well go for the same sort of system as you, to make it a slightly different electoral system to the other house.
Is it possible that may happen, or do you have any?
I think this present government is a bit too cautious. It's a bit too conservative.
What would I like to see in terms of the House of Lords reforms? I'm on the Lords Reform Committee, and I've been hoping to see the government live up to its promise in the programme it set out before the last election, that we would have a more democratically accountable House of Lords. I would like to see that combined with retaining some of the deep expertise that the House of Lords currently has. So I would like to see some people in the House of Lords elected, some people appointed as now. But I would, above all, like to see the House of Lords be independent of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister currently appoints people to the House of Lords. He appoints people to oversee his own actions. The contradictions in that are pretty clear, and I would like to see the House of Lords become much more independent of the Prime Minister.
Well, we've said that we ought to see more of an elected element, because if once you start tinkering around a mechanism that is working, which it was, then you have to think through the logical consequences of it all. And the stagnant position of the House of Lords at the moment, and the unsatisfactory position, however useful they are to us as the Commons, is one that is not thought through, and it is absolutely classic of the government that they produce a piece of legislation and haven't thought through the consequences.
And the difficulty is that there is a public cynicism about politics and politicians. So when the public are asked really about reforming the House of Lords and having an elected House of Lords, they look at it and they say, well, it would be another bunch of those elected politicians that we don't like going in there. So whether it's appointed people or whether it's elected people, we don't see much difference. And there's a kind of general sense of apathy around changing it. It's not top of people's political agenda. That's health and education, the economy and all of that. And so the government have realised that they can probably get away with not changing it. And as long as they don't change it, as long as the House of Lords doesn't have democratic legitimacy, then the Prime Minister and the ministers, the government who are in the House of Commons, can really bully them into doing what they like. They cause a bit of a problem from time to time, but if it comes to any kind of showdown, ultimately the government say, you're not elected and we are, so we win. And what they're really scared about is the dynamic of having an elected Senate, second chamber, which might start to assert itself a bit more and could claim legitimacy because it was elected. So in a sense, as long as they are not elected, they're pretty powerless. They're an irritant. They annoy the government, but they can't really do anything. And I think they're very, very scared about having an elected chamber that would act as a more effective counterbalance. We as kind of pluralists in my party, we sort of believe in a very sort of pluralist democracy with power distributed across different centres. We would love to see that. But parties like the Labour Party, who have a tradition of being in government where they concentrated all the power to themselves, the Prime Minister is supremely powerful in the British system. They don't want to see power dispersed, and as long as only the House of Commons is elected, they've got all that power collected to themselves.
The House of Lords, I mean, it's curious. It's a curious institution. Most people, I think, see it as just a sort of oddity, really. There has been changes to the House of Lords. There was a commission of inquiry before we made the changes. That was an attempt to build some sort of consensus for the changes. I actually submitted my own evidence to that inquiry, and I argued for a fully elected second chamber. Didn't believe that you could go to it as a directly elected second chamber first in one go, and I think there are a series of steps that you can get there. And I think a chamber like that could be an integrating chamber that would allow strong regional representation from different parts of the country. However, the government hasn't gone as far as that. It has abolished the hereditary right for people by accident of their birth being able to legislate in the UK, which for 700 or 800 years has stood, and I and many others would argue was long overdue for overhaul. But we've still got a hybrid second chamber in which appointment is the principal way that people take their place. Appointments now which are made by an independent commission rather than by the Prime Minister, so that's the other reform that Labour's brought in, so to remove the particular patronage that the Prime Minister had to put people in the Lords. So, you know, I think we've definitely improved the workings of the House of Lords. I think we've definitely improved its legitimacy and the basis on which it does its work. I still personally think our aim must be to move to a fully democratic chamber as a reforming, revising part of the Houses of Parliament.
It certainly will decline as a small body, but it still remains very much a conservative body on virtually all issues. There are people who are reporting the status quo and are resistant to change. And it's a matter of considerable sorrow to those of us who thought that the coming of Labour governments would mean that at last we do what we hadn't done for a couple of centuries and reform the House of Lords. We've reformed it in a piecemeal system. And Lloyd George, a Welsh Prime Minister in the 20s, once said, it's fatal to try to cross a chasm with two leaps. And that's precisely what we're trying to do with the House of Lords. We half reformed it and then try to do the second half later. And you fall in the chasm in the middle. We've been doing that. So we're in a state of limbo at the moment as far as the Lords is concerned.
I think people dislike the yah-boo element of Parliament, and they do often behave like schoolboys in there. I think it should be less confrontational. I think we should be able to get a better debate without trying to score points, and I really wish we could improve that. I think it gives a very bad impression of the country.
The most frustrating is the time wasting that we have. The system is very antiquated, and it's interesting you compare it, for example, with the new democracies in Eastern Europe. We'll go to a European meeting now, and at a European meeting you've got people from Slovenia and Estonia and Poland and all these places where they've developed their democracies, if you like, from scratch without baggage. And they have a much more modern, efficient ways of doing things. This place is built up on a whole load of tradition that goes back several hundred years, and there's a real fear about changing anything. So we end up doing a lot of stuff where we waste time. I was here till 1:30 in the morning last night because somebody had spoken for 3 hours on a motion that meant nothing in order to keep us there for that period of time. we've got rid of some of that, but there's still a lot left. So that lack of a sort of sense of we're here as a sort of corporate body trying to do the job well is something that ends up being very frustrating. You can, in a week, feel that you've spent 15 useful hours, but perhaps 30 less useful hours, and that balance is wrong.
I mean, I'm a backbencher by choice, which is someone who doesn't aspire to office. I was on the front bench. I was a shadow minister for 3 years. I entered Parliament, but I deliberately took a decision to go on the backbench and to become a campaigner, because I believe that's more influential. Because for various reasons, I believe that because of the party discipline, you can exercise very little power, even as a minister, particularly as a junior minister, and you're much more powerful to have a voice on the backbenches. But the difficulty is the inertia of public opinion, of trying to persuade people of radical ideas. I mean, I believe that with the cooperation with one of your countrymen called Professor Brad Rodu from the University of Alabama, I'm trying to put forward a case for what will be the biggest single improvement in public health that is likely to occur in the next 50 years. And that's to persuade people who are smokers, veteran smokers, not to give up tobacco, but to switch to smokeless tobacco. But we're against, I think that's a big frustration, is a refusal of people to shift their views once they've got something in their head. My longest campaign I've been on is on illegal drugs, where we're completely balmy with illegal drugs because of a policy we inherited in the 20s from your country, when there was a prohibition of alcohol, and they also prohibited a certain number of drugs. They weren't the most dangerous drugs, they weren't the most addictive drugs, and the world has suffered perversely from that, with a huge use of those drugs. And the consequence has been a vast increase in drug crime and in drug deaths. But I mean, it's such a slow period to get even medicinal cannabis in use in Britain. It will be this year. But I had a bill about this 14 years ago in this Parliament. And I was regarded as sort of a sad drug pusher for even suggesting that people should use cannabis.
While there are frustrating aspects to being a member of Parliament, long nights and long campaigning for a legislative cause were just two that were mentioned, MPs get a great deal of satisfaction from their job, sometimes getting, as Jackie Late tells us, that nice warm glow that comes from helping somebody. So, not only do MPs get to play a part in making the British Parliament work, they also get to make a difference.
In opposition, doing our best to defeat the government, which is quite difficult when there's a majority of 200 against you, or to change their iniquitous legislation.
That's the most satisfying part.
If we succeed, that's the most satisfying.
And is the most frustrating dealing with this social work aspect, or is there other frustrating?
No, it's not frustrating.
Oh.
It's actually very interesting, and hopefully when you can sort out a constituent's problems, then you feel a nice warm glow.
I mean, there are two sides to that. One, at the personal level, the most satisfying thing is when you can resolve a problem for a constituent. So when somebody's actually been to see you, and at a personal level, this is tremendously satisfying. They've been to see you, they've got a problem, you've sorted it out, and you know that individual, you have a relationship with them. And that personal side of the political system, I think, is very important. That's what keeps you going. The fact that Mrs. Smith now has got the welfare check that she needs, which they wouldn't have had without you. And then at the kind of more the professional side of the work, or the intellectual side of the work, it's being able to satisfy your curiosity. If you have a question about how something works, as an MP you can go and find out. So if you want to know, I've always wanted to know, how do the courts work? The criminal courts, what happens there? I can ring up and get an invitation by the judge to come down to the courts and get taken through exactly what happens. I want to know how the hospital works. The surgeon at the hospital will be more than willing to have me down there and tell me how the hospital emergency system works. So it's that ability to sort of find out about things and satisfy your curiosity that it's a brilliant job for. It opens all these doors so you can go and learn about stuff.
Yeah, I try and get out about quite a lot.
For a handbag.
Oh, right.
I don't know.
Where was that then?
Way down there.
Oh, right.
I don't know.
Well, we'll just keep an eye on it. Thanks.
Not a problem, is there?
No, it's a loaf of bread.
So you don't find it too jarring to go from the House of Commons to picking up handbags in the Nettos?
It's all part of the job, and I tell you, that's the beauty of being an MP.
We've tried to give you some insight into the basic functionings of the British political system, with the added benefit of hearing from members of Parliament themselves about what MPs do and how Parliament works. I hope that this approach not only helps you understand democracy in the United Kingdom, but also parliamentary systems in general, as they make up the majority of democratic systems in the world. Wouldn't you like to go to Ballymore? Ballymore, what a place, or what a place it is. Check him on the right spot, please.
Let's use this footage.
Wouldn't you like to take a trip to go? Behind me is the Palace of Westminster. You can probably even hear Big Ben chiming in the background. This is where the House of Commons meets, and it's not chiming in the background.
Yeah. Has it always been there?
I mean, I think it's on the eyepiece.
It's still there.
I don't see anything there. I think it's inside there. On the eyepiece. Social Democratic Party of Great Britain.
Excuse me, do you know... Sorry about this. Do you know this area a lot?
No, not very well.
Oh, I want to know where Lambeth Pier is.
Do you know Lambeth Pier? Yeah, we are. Sorry. We're no help.
What part are you from?
Kansas.